Hi everyone, this is Ben Collins from Sage Intacct, and just want to start by saying thanks for joining us today. We've got a pretty short but also pretty topical session which will focus on how emerging FinTech providers should be thinking a little bit behind the scenes about what their ideal finance tech stack should look like. This is a pretty interesting topic to talk about with a tech audience. It's also something that can often be overlooked by companies in the FinTech space. You're so focused on growing the business, but you also need to make sure you have the systems in place that can scale as you grow your operations. So over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to share some of the best practices and insights that we've gleaned from working with clients within the FinTech space to help them construct a flexible but also powerful set of back-end financial systems. In working with these clients, we've seen some patterns start to emerge over time. So I'd just like to share some of these patterns, and those will hopefully help you frame some of these issues in your own head and also assist in navigating what can sometimes be a difficult process. So before we get started, just want to provide a little bit of my own background. So you can see here by the slide, I am a lifelong Bostonian. Born and raised in Reading, Mass. Went to BC High, also went to college locally at Harvard. After living in the Back Bay in Cambridge, ending up in Andover, when we needed a little bit more space, I now actually live up in Boxford with my wife and my two sons. Now, in terms of my professional background, I've actually straddled the finance and tech worlds for my entire career. Started as an investment banker, working with small to mid-market tech companies to help raise capital or with M&A transactions. And then I transitioned over to operational roles within tech companies. So most recently I was with SS&C Intralinks, and now with Sage Intacct. So as an aside, I've always loved these types of focused local events, and we're a proud sponsor of Boston FinTech Week, as they really help foster a sense of community amongst those who attend. So obviously wish we could do this in person, and definitely hoping we'll be able to get everyone together to do this in person next year. All right, so as we kick off today, and really just to set the stage for today's discussion, there are really two things that I'd like to center the conversation around today. The first is really, how do you create a frictionless customer experience on the billing and cash flow side, which when you put it in big, bold font like this, probably doesn't seem as ominous as maybe it can turn out to be. And it shouldn't be overly ominous, and we'll get into ways to help mitigate that. But that's one side of the equation. Then the other is, how do you get the reporting on your end, on your side, to help guide and help inform your decision making? So it's really about having that actionable data that can be such a critical component of FinTech company success. Okay, so just to set the stage for what we're going to talk about here today, here are the four key takeaways that hopefully you're going to leave this discussion with. So we're going to start with how you accomplish those two things that I previously mentioned. How do you create a frictionless billing experience as well as a dynamic reporting engine? And we're not going to get into the nuts and bolts of it. This is probably a business class curriculum for an entire semester. So we'll touch on the aspects here. To say we're going to solve it over the course of a short presentation, though, would probably be giving myself certainly too much credit. But we'll touch on some of those themes. Also, how do you tie into the creation of a checklist that's appropriate for your company's finance team to follow when constructing and thinking through the tech stack requirements for your organization? I'll also touch on what reporting you need to create in order to support the growth of your business and help guide which operational levers you should be, as a management team, thinking about pulling. And lastly, what exactly are the different components that comprise the finance team's tech stack? All right, so let's talk about some of the core elements that you need to be thinking through when assessing the technology needs of your financial operations team. Now, within finance and accounting, you're often thinking about, how do we make our operations more efficient, or how do I invoice more effectively and accurately? But you also need to take a step back and be considerate and thinking through the customer side of the equation. So being able to respond to an evolving set of customer needs should also be an area of focus. And you need to do that without sacrificing any of those core requirements for those people that sit in the finance function. So it's a difficult line that needs to be navigated, and it can be a thin line at times. Now, I've been part of organizations where our entire go-to-market strategy was really based and predicated on what our back-end systems could support. So it was sort of, at least in the opinion of most, at least on the sales side and the marketing side, sort of a backwards way to approach things. Trying to shoehorn contracts into this rigid system was really nothing short of a nightmare. So, really understanding your client's needs is paramount, and it's also nice to have, flexible systems in place that can accommodate any changes that are made along the way, because there are bound to be changes. You also need to be in a position where you can respond to your product team. So as they develop new products and think about ways and come up with different ways to monetize new features. Otherwise, you might get stuck where a contract comes through, not quite sure how to invoice it. You have to build in some of that flexibility. So it almost has to be inherent into the system, because accommodating the customers and also the business needs, product needs, with the accounting requirements, is a tough act to balance, but one that needs to be navigated and sorted through. Now, looking at the second bullet here, as we look at the accounting foundation, it's important that the basics are in order before you start to get overly intricate, and then work out from there. So we definitely advocate a crawl, walk, run approach when it comes to creating the tech stack. Doing it gradually can actually have a lot of benefits, so long as the foundational elements and those core elements are strong. Now, for most companies, it starts with the core accounting systems, and then you work out from there. So that's looking at things like revenue recognition, invoicing processes, sales tax, things of that nature. Now, that order might be a little different for different companies, but that's usually what the progression looks like, and one that we've seen companies follow when looking to build out their tech suite. And we're talking, some of these are early stage companies, and that's how I'm framing some of these things. So let's next think about some of the use cases, and making sure that they're aligned to the market. So there's the expense side of finance, but in a lot of respects, the accounts payable really not that different from company to company. But what about the billing use case? So how are you trying to monetize that customer relationship, stay ahead of your competitors? Now, this can often be a pretty significant point of contention between the sales and finance teams, in terms of how much flexibility do you really want to put into the billing system. There's definitely flexibility that's required, but how much is too much, right? You need to have some controls in place there. So really that comes down to having good partners across the organization that understand that there are finance requirements, and you're not just setting up rules to set up rules. And they're willing to understand those requirements. And that's the optimal setup. But you're always going to have some of those exceptions, right? Especially if you're early stage and really just in that, you need to get deals done mentality. So I would suggest, looking to solve the majority of the use cases you have, try to put some controls around what can be done, get finance connected with other internal groups like sales, product, et cetera. Now, in the billing use case scenario, having finance looped in early ensures that the contracts going out to prospects and customers are accounting friendly, back office friendly, and that sort of alignment with counterparts across the organization really helps build out that framework and establish controls. And the point about exceptions, bringing the finance team to their knees, and potentially senior management as well, I guess, might be a little bit hyperbolic, but really that misalignment on the capabilities of the tech stack can throw a pretty significant monkey wrench into things in a pretty short amount of time. Now, the last component to have in place is really understanding how, and the complexities around technical debt, which is kind of a tricky thing to talk about, especially in advance, right? But, it's like that credit card, or I like to think about it, or I try not to think about it, but when I do, it's almost like that. I think an appropriate analogy is really that credit card with that just completely absurd APR. Maybe you had this in college when it was the only option, but it's, like 26% APR. Now, the more complexity you build into the contracting model now, just like that crazy APR can make things more complicated and really ultimately more expensive, as things evolve and as time goes by and when volume starts picking up. So as you go from billing 100 to 500 to 1,000 customers, you really need an integrated set of systems where data flows aren't constricted, which is why some clients, they work with their CRM administrator, because sometimes that CRM data creates the quote to cash instance. Now, I would just be mindful of the hard coding. Now, the number of workarounds that the team is employing. Keep an eye on those exceptions. There will always be exceptions. We've talked about that, but is that percentage of exceptions relatively stable? Now, if it's not, and if it's on a consistent upward trajectory, it's probably time to take a step back and get ahead of things before that debt becomes a burden. So in our experience, we've started to see some patterns over time, and maybe some of you with us here today have some experience with this. So when you start building your company, the company's growing, generally speaking, the finance team, their hair is on fire trying to manage things. Now, the inclination for most technology firms and FinTech firms is to default to what they know, and that's really technology. So they start putting in tech solutions, and I use the word solution here pretty loosely, but they put them in these solutions on a piecemeal basis in order to put out some of these fires or at least try and suppress them. But it often has actually the opposite effect and creates a really big complex layer of data, which is really difficult to extract meaningful insights from. So you've got this huge disparate data set. Now more time is going to be spent on integrations and then more time creating manual workarounds. And it's sort of this vicious cycle that you get in where the more time you have to do that, the more time you're delaying the monthly close. Now, moving on from that, you've got multiple systems of record, and then sometimes that turns into staff meetings where sometimes it can devolve into people arguing about whose data is correct, which typically isn't productive, nor is it fun. So it really comes back to the notion that in order to be effective, you need to think about people, the process, and the technology. But there really is that fourth horse in the race, and that's data. And to really set your business up for success, you need to have a pragmatic approach to your tech investments. All right, so that brings us to this checklist that you can use when you start thinking about building out your tech stack. Now, as we discussed, initially you'll probably just need basic accounting, finance-related information, really just getting your arms around your financials at the end of every month. Then as you become a little bit more sophisticated, you need to start really looking at your business use cases, especially around billing, revenue recognition, making sure that you've got all of that documented. Maybe it's the current state of what you're doing today and knowing that you need to get to a future state and trying to look at the systems that will hopefully help drive that evolution. And as we touched on previously, the data layer is pretty interesting here. So it's really understanding what is it that your company's success is truly being measured on. You know, how are you defining that success? How are investors defining that success? And what do you want to report on? And then how do you get your system set up to be able to report on that data automatically? And again, every company is a little bit different. They handle that differently, but you don't want the finance team to be mired in spreadsheets day in, day out, just manipulating this data. So you need to think about the different systems that create data, where it's captured, does it need to combine with other data, and are those systems compatible? As we've talked about, there are always going to be exceptions. So how will you handle those exceptions? Can you be flexible? Can you adapt? Can you reevaluate your process and your tools to help support getting those exceptions done in the most effective way possible? And then lastly, and probably the least fun piece of this entire process, or at least to most on the line, I don't know, maybe it's something that people are all chopping at the bit to discuss, but one of the most important really is around compliance. So that's really about making sure that you have the ability to report on the business internally, to your board, to your leaders and investors in a way that makes sense to them. So how can you get that data in a way that will get you through an audit and any of the other kinds of tax or compliance related items that you need to handle? Now, in talking with clients, we see that there's a lot of variety in terms of the billing and the billing use cases, and those can be influenced by a number of different factors, some of which are captured in the chevrons that you can see on this slide. So what is the target market? Is it SMB or is it enterprise? What's the term of these contracts? Is it monthly? Is it annual? Are the contracts transactional or are they subscription? Now, I'm not going to read out each one that's captured here, but these are questions, and these are the types of questions that you need to have pretty clear answers to when thinking about what your technology needs are going to be. Now, the unfortunate piece underlying all of these different models and some of the questions that you can see here is that all too often, finance leaders just aren't brought into conversations when the company is developing or launching new products. So someone in finance might not even learn about a product or some new feature until it's in a contract, and then they need to act on it. So you really need to dig into what is it that you're really selling. For instance, Can you really support both transactional and subscription contracts? Do you want to be doing that? Is that how clients want to be doing that? So really, understanding that target market. From there, you can put the proper policies in place and develop your use cases around how you might structure a contract and how you might support that with the billing piece and how you can support that with revenue recognition. With FinTech companies, there's a lot of complexities and a lot of variation in terms of what I just talked about. You could have subscription, you could be transaction focused, you could have usage, consumption, hardware in your revenue streams. So it's really about going back to that question of data. So where it's all coming from, and is this data coming from Stripe? Is it coming directly from your SaaS application that's housing it? And then does that data now need to feed into your accounting system in order to invoice properly? So I'm probably making these questions and this entire slide and maybe this entire presentation sound a bit more daunting and ominous than they really are or maybe should be. But these can be tricky questions to sort through. But the answers to them are ultimately going to drive what type of tech solution your business requires. So a well-constructed tech stack is really ultimately, it's driving a number of things, but one of the core theses behind investment in the tech stack is really about reducing reporting struggles. And some of the, a lot of companies, whether it's FinTech or other technology providers, and really this goes for almost any industry, struggle with some of those reports and really trying to glean insights, based on a massive amount of data that's flowing within their internal systems. So some of the most common reports that we've heard of, and these probably aren't going to come as a huge surprise to anyone who's listening here. These are now monthly ones to help folks who are managing their business, but these are around both billings and bookings, the ARR contribution, churn rates, retention rates. If you're in the services business or if you have a professional services team, obviously the professional services backlog or utilization rates are pretty key numbers for your services team to be monitoring and tracking on a regular basis. But it's really about moving on and transitioning from that data deluge or data dump that you get from your general ledger accounts into something that can actually help you manage your business, right? So it's about making sense of all of that underlying data that's flowing amongst your disparate internal systems. So it's also important to mention the process behind how you get this data. So many systems providers are going to tell you that you can get this information, but really it comes down to the old adage of bad data in, bad data out. So when you're looking at new technology, it's really important, and I can't stress this enough, to really know your business, document your use cases like we've talked about earlier, conduct a formal and thorough evaluation, get a product demonstration, ask a lot of questions, ask for references, and see what others are saying about their experience on these different platforms. But also, this is really important, know your people. So it's really critical to understand your current workflows and involving the actual end users of this technology during the evaluation process, right? We talk a lot in tech about disruptive technology. Now, disruptive generally means good in that context, but it can also, disruptive can be bad, and that's what we want to avoid. So, involving these people and these teams across the organization during the evaluation process really helps aid in alignment and also ultimately the implementation and the adoption of any software you invest in. So as we look at this slide, which is titled The Ideal Finance Tech Stack, I think, actually the title for this could be, or probably should be, the Comprehensive Finance Tech Stack, as not all of these different options and processes depicted here will apply to every organization. But as you think about each of these different discrete processes, the goal really is to try and think about them holistically. So you can envision them as part of your entire tech stack working together in tandem with data flows that hopefully aren't restricted in any major ways. So this slide here shows the major components of what your technology infrastructure needs to support, captures what you're doing on the revenue side with all the different billing scenarios depicted, ties into your cash flow. There's also the expense side of things, sales tax, doing your revenue recognition, and then a lot of the core accounting on the back end with the close and the compliance as well. So these are really the major aspects to consider in terms of the functionality and systems that constitute your tech stack. All right, so I just want to share a visual of what the net effect of getting that infrastructure and that tech stack nailed up front can look like. So, it could be a nice, clean outcome like this. Everyone likes a dashboard. So now this dashboard is one from our own systems, and it's a gratuitous product placement. but really, regardless of the application, you really want to have a vision of what that after scenario looks like when you're selecting your technology partners. It really helps frame things and helps the team drive towards that end goal. All right, so I just want to recap some of the key things that I hope you'll take away from this session. The first is really around, how do you create your tech stack? And that really takes into account those two different dimensions that we talked about earlier, both the needs of your finance team as well as the demands of the market. Also, what should go into your checklist as you're evaluating different technology options and different vendors. Then also thinking through what are the reporting requirements that your company requires. So what sort of insights does your team need? And then once you've gone through all those, then you can lay out what sort of systems should be invested in, and then hopefully have universal or at least cross-functional buy-in in terms of where those investments are. Now, one CFO recently told us that similar to how development or product development has their own product roadmap, now the finance team actually has their own roadmap in terms of technology investments. So if you think about some of those internal pain points around the finance function, take a minute, map out where those challenges exist, and work with the stakeholders across your organization to figure out if there's a tech solution that might be able to streamline things. So these days, finance leaders really serve as the stewards of the data, or most of the data across the organization. Now, they may not own the entire data set, but they definitely need to know where everything is coming from, and having a seat at the table in terms of what investments are made in terms of technology and the flows of that data is really critical. So in the past, everything we talked about here today was typically owned by the IT function, and the finance team, and really all internal functions for that matter, were essentially a customer of what was being delivered. Sure, you can weigh in with your requirements. More and more, we now see that as the functional groups are starting to own that process and take that over. So you do need to be up to speed on technology. One of the things that the famous coach or former coach of the New England Patriots said that if he was going to coach the team, he wanted to pick the players. So the analogy he used was, if I'm going to make dinner, I want to shop for the groceries. And sort of the same concept applies here, right? The finance team is going to be using these systems day in, day out. So they need to spearhead what their tech stack looks like. So that wraps up the presentation and slides that I had prepared for today. But if you do have any questions around anything that I covered or talked about today, obviously, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. Now, if you want to learn more about what we do here at Sage Intacct, and we're a leading provider of cloud accounting software, by the way, I guess I forgot to mention that, feel free to connect with me this week. I'll be kicking around our virtual booth here. And we've also got a bunch of different ways to learn more about us, which can all be found on our website. Thanks again for spending a few minutes with us today, and hope everyone has a terrific week. Bye, everyone.